To introduce our first speaker, can I welcome the Honourable Chris Rath, MLC. Mr Rath is a member of the Liberal Party and the Opposition Whip in the Legislative Council. He is also the Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Law and Justice and of the Selection of Bills Committee. He has a chapter published in the book, The Forgotten People, Updated Liberal Essays on Modern Australia, and he enjoys marathon running, sailing, skiing, opera, and of course, history. Please welcome me in inviting to the stage the Honourable Chris Rath.
Thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you as Clerk of the Parliaments, together with the President, Ben Franklin, the Usher of the Black Rod, Janelle, and to all of the staff here at the Parliament for making these very important bicentenary celebrations possible. Ladies and gentlemen, before we delve into the historical circumstances that led to Parliament and the Supreme Court being introduced in New South Wales, it is vital that we first understand the geopolitical context of the early New South Wales colony. This morning's first session on New South Wales in the world of empire will help deepen our understanding of New South Wales' place in the world of the 1820s and how colonies like New South Wales became places of extraordinary international vitality and, importantly, sites for the development of novel experiments in political and administrative institutions. To help us explore New South Wales' place in the world of empire, it is my pleasure to hand to our first speaker of the day, Professor Stephen Garton, AM. Stephen is currently a Professor of History and Principal Advisor to the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sydney. He is the author or co-author of 7 books and over 80 articles and chapters on various aspects of Australian social and cultural history, and also the history of British dominions and aspects of American history, focusing on such themes as the history of madness, crime, masculinity, and the aftermath of war. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, the Royal Australian Historical Society, and the Royal Society of New South Wales. Stephen has also had a long career in the university administration at the University of Sydney, serving as head of the History Department from 1996 to 98, Dean of the Arts Faculty from 2001 to 2009, Deputy Vice-Chancellor from 2009 to 2019, and Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor from 2019 to 2021. He was also Interim Vice-Chancellor and Principal from 2020 to 2021. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Garton, AM.
Thank you for that cringe-worthy introduction. But before I begin, let me also acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the graciousness with which Indigenous Australians have managed the last 12 months, which have been difficult, I think, for everyone. And I would also like to note the President's acknowledgement of country, which I thought was particularly nuanced and gracious as well. I'm not going to be able to open this water, so I'm going to... All right. So the seed for this paper was planted nearly 50 years ago. In the mid-1970s, I was a harried honours student at the University of Sydney History Department, writing a thesis on British attitudes to India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Specifically, the impact of British utilitarian philosophy on racial ideas and colonial policies, most evident in the 6-volume History of British India written by James Mill, disciple of Jeremy Bentham and father of John Stuart Mill. Now, I'm not going to strain your patience by explaining the arguments. Suffice to say, Mill's impact on European attitudes to Indian culture was profound. One of the key intellectual and cultural streams helping to erode the former, albeit Orientalist, appreciations of Indian culture, and replacing them with representations of India as backward, depraved, and in great need of Western enlightenment, attitudes to many subject peoples that pervaded Victorian views of race thereafter. Well, I needed to read widely into British literature on India in the period, and I was told that the Library of the New South Wales Parliament had an excellent collection of important works, some of which were held at no other library in Australia. I, of course, needed a special introduction to get access to the Parliamentary Library, which was generously granted, and I spent a pleasant couple of weeks in the library, which was then right at the very front, on a room facing into Macquarie Street, working my way through those sources. And while there, I just, as a callow youth, remarked to the Parliamentary Librarian, "What a wonderful collection." And he kindly explained in a polite way my ignorance, saying it's not so surprising. After all, New South Wales had been part of the Archdiocese of Calcutta until the 1850s. The link between Sydney and Calcutta was actually a very strong one. Well, these days, historians are attuned to the transnational dimensions of nations, peoples, places, ideas, and policies. And it will come as no surprise to anyone here today to know that New South Wales was part of a wider British world. A link in a vital chain of trade routes, economic ties, military, administrative, political, and religious institutions, laws, rituals, habits of thought, and familial ties across continents that shaped the evolution of early colonial society. And on an occasion when we are here to explore colonial society, and more importantly, the political and institutional culture of the early colony, especially around 1823, with the formation of the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court, it's hopefully helpful to attempt to place the evolution of Australian institutions in their wider transnational context. And here I propose to cast a wide net and explore how a number of colonists came bearing their experiences of other places and cultures, and equally importantly, many of those who settled here and prospered did so because they sustained vital economic, social, political, familial and religious networks within that larger British world. So while New South Wales was a settler colony in the age when the monopoly of the East India Company was increasingly being dismantled, first in 1813 and further in 1833, ushering in an era of what historians have called free trade imperialism, colonial prosperity was dependent on the ability of colonists to capitalise on the economic opportunities afforded by British trade and commerce. The evolution of colonial institutions also drew on examples of governance arrangements throughout the wider empire, seeking to configure and reconfigure British institutions to best position colonists and the colony to thrive in this wider imperial environment. Naturally, there are intense political conflicts around competing visions, priorities and strategies for the creation and maintenance of wealth, respectability and power in the colony. But many of the novel outcomes of these differences drew on ideas and institutions from the wider British world, and equally sometimes fostered innovations that impacted that wider world. As we know, early colonial administrators were largely drawn from a cohort of soldiers, naval men and administrators who travelled around the empire and the wider world, serving British interests. Governor Phillip, a naval man, saw action in the 7 Years' War and the war against the American colonies. He also served in Havana, South America, France and India before commanding the First Fleet. His friend, Philip Gidley King, another naval man, it was reputedly easier for a man of humble origins to rise in the Navy than in the Army. He spent time in the East Indies, the American colonies and India before joining Philip in New South Wales. Macquarie, an army man, served in Nova Scotia, New York, Charleston, Jamaica, India and Egypt before becoming Governor of New South Wales. And similarly, many of his successors were men of wide experience in empire administration, where they adapted British civil and military administrative arrangements, reconfiguring them to suit the particular conditions of each place. Thomas Brisbane had experience in Flanders, Jamaica, India, America and Europe, and more germane to our concerns here, Ralph Darling, the Governor of New South Wales during the establishment of the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court, was another army man who had served in Spain and the West Indies and was actually the administrator of the colony of Mauritius before becoming Governor of New South Wales. And the list could go on and on with respect to its senior administrators of the early colony. Men of the cloth mostly had less varied experience of empire, but nonetheless were embedded in wider international networks. The early Anglican archdeacons of the colony, Thomas Hobbs Scott, who first came here to New South Wales in 1819 with Commissioner Bigg and returned as archdeacon in 1824 and was a member of the Legislative Council, like his successor from 1829, William Grant Broughton. Both were English-born, bred and trained, although Broughton briefly worked for the East India Company in London. And, as we know, in these early years, the Sydney archdeacons reported to Canterbury through the Calcutta Archdiocese. Although there were a few Irish Catholic priests who arrived as convicts after the 1798 rebellion, the Catholic Church didn't send out priests until 1820 with the arrival of John Joseph Terry and Philip Conley. Although Terry and Conley were Irish, English Benedictines dominated the early Catholic hierarchy in New South Wales. In the 1830s, William Ullathorne, a Yorkshireman, and John Bede Paulding, a Lancashire man, led the Catholic Church in New South Wales, respectively as Vicar General and Archbishop. Catholic priests in the early colony obviously owed their allegiance to Rome and much of their experience to Ireland, itself part of empire. Officially, and as many in this audience will know, these early Catholic leaders reported through the Vicar Apostolic of Mauritius, Madagascar and the Cape Colony, William Placid Morris. Evangelicals were also prominent in the colony. From its formation in 1795, the non-denominational Protestant, but largely Wesleyan and Anglican London Missionary Society sent over 1,800 missionaries to China, India, Africa and the South Pacific. Sydney's was termed part of the South Pacific before World War II. Many of those sent to the South Pacific came through Sydney, and a few, such as William Pascoe Crook and Lancelot Thrakeld, settled in New South Wales, becoming major influences in the early evangelical history of the colony, although they quickly ran into trouble with the Society's principal agent in New South Wales, the Reverend Samuel Marsden. Well, they weren't alone in that. We can also go to the other end of the social scale. There were 11 convicts of African descent on the First Fleet, including Australia's first bushranger, Black Caesar. Others followed. One, Billy Blue, was a well-known figure in the early colony. His name to this day recorded as an iconic feature of Sydney Harbour. Many early colonists, including governors, brought Indian and Chinese servants to New South Wales, and some landowners brought Asian labourers to work their properties. The gold rushes brought more. As Henry Reynolds has argued, colonial Australia was a remarkably multicultural society. During the gold rushes, 20% of the adult male population of Victoria were Chinese. 19th century Australia had many of African, Afghan, Pacifica, Chinese, Indian, North and South American and Southeast Asian descent. The later White Australia policy was an effort to turn back the tide, a tide that in some respects had already washed ashore. By 1820, as it became evident that New South Wales was to be much more than a convict colony, with an increasing proportion of free settlers and many emancipists, and significant profits possible through the burgeoning trade in whaling, sealing, and later wool and agriculture, the colony became an attractive place for social advancement. Institutions promoting British culture and cementing ties between the emerging middle class were established. In 1814, the Reverend Samuel Marsden persuaded a number of benefactors in Britain to donate a substantial collection of books to establish a circulating library. Strangely, all those books found their way into Marsden's private collection. But it's not until 1826 that prominent colonists established the first subscription library. And the person who convened that meeting was a barrister and public servant, John Macinnes, who in the same year convened another public meeting of, quotes, gentry, magistrates, merchants, landholders, farmers, traders, and other free inhabitants to petition Governor Darling for part-elected Legislative Council and trial by jury. A few years earlier, in 1821, the Philosophical Society, charged with promoting the study of natural philosophy in the colony, what we call science now, was established by prominent citizens, including Supreme Court Justice Baron Field, Colonial Secretary Francis Goulburn, and a Scotsman, Francis Irvine, who'd served in the British Army in India and spent 15 years in Bombay and Calcutta, where he was a prominent member of the Bombay Literary Society and the influential Oriental Society in Calcutta, established by Sir William Jones, Britain's foremost scholar of Indian languages and culture in the 18th century. This effort at scientific uplift in New South Wales didn't last long, but many of the founders became members of the new Agricultural Society, established the following year to promote scientific study of agriculture and pastoralism in the colony. And we could multiply these examples many times. A relatively prosperous, independent-minded middle class was growing and seeking to create the institutions of civil society befitting men of substance. Wealth and a desire for respectability and recognition fired up colonists on many fronts, not least the desire for political representation and a check on the power of governors. Land and trade were the keys to colonial wealth, and New South Wales' mercantile economy was a critical area of engagement with this wider British world. As Australia's foremost historian of colonial shipping, Frank Breuser, has explained, until 1850, when the Navigation Acts ceased to operate, all British shipping routes in the Empire were reserved for ships registered in Britain or its colonies. British shipping dominated Australian trade, bringing essential cargoes to the colonies, initially obviously convicts and supplies, later free settlers and goods in high demand. In the early decades of the 19th century, however, there was insufficient tonnage to take back home, despite the growing whaling and sealing trade, until wool exports really began to take off in the late 1830s, which created a significant trade imbalance in the route between Britain and New South Wales. Colonists had to grow the whaling, sealing, wool and pastoral industries to reduce that burden. Another option was for Australian shipping to plug gaps in the market, developing intra-colonial routes to bring goods from smaller ports to Sydney, providing more goods for ships returning to Britain. Colonial merchants also developed their own trade routes, focusing especially on the South Pacific, China, India, Southeast Asia, and as far west as Mauritius, bringing to the colony, as the lovely book by James Broadbent, Margaret Stephen and Suzanne Rickard shows in beautiful detail, goods such as tea, sandalwood, lacquerware, silks, rugs, furniture, porcelain and spices. This thriving trade with Asia and the Pacific speaks to the growing prosperous middle classes in the colony. But as the work of Grace Karskens and others investigating the Cumberland site in the rock shows, objects such as porcelain plates could be found in some of Sydney's poorer districts, indicating that demand for goods traded from India and China and elsewhere was intense and widespread. Sydney merchants had to navigate, if you'll forgive the pun, the complexities of imperial trade and shipping to thrive. Many of the colony's wealthy citizens were pastoralists and agriculturalists who profited from the lands acquired through the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and then granted through the grace and favour of governors and the buying and selling of property. A merchant class also emerged in the colony, and of course there was a symbiotic relationship between the two. Producers need to sell their produce, merchants needed produce to sell. More importantly, many merchants became prominent landowners, and landowners diversified their holdings by entering trade and commerce, thus enmeshing many colonists in the larger needs of empire trade. So the products of land, sea and trade and the production and circulation of capital required other institutions for their ongoing survival. Financial institutions, forms of insurance, banks, brokers, lenders, guarantors and more. Again, the wider empire networks often underwrote early colonial enterprises. This was the age of banks. By 1813, Britain had 761 banks, some of them based in India, and some of them were also merchant houses which added lending to their list of services. The Bank of New South Wales, founded in 1817, survived difficult economic winds because it had viceregal support. But the ill-fated Bank of Australia, established in 1826 with many leading Sydney merchants on the board, was dependent on British and Indian merchant houses and banks extending credit facilities for their colonial clients. One reason why it collapsed was those lines of credit were not forthcoming when the imperial economy suffered a major downturn in the 1840s and others during the 19th century. The first colonial insurance firm was established in Tasmania in 1838, the Derwent and Tamar Company. But for many decades, colonial merchants, traders and producers were reliant on taking significant risks with each voyage and often had to rely on lines of credit from other merchants or banks in England, India or other parts of the empire to survive. When we look at the prosperous colonial middle class before 1850, we can glimpse extraordinary crossovers and interdependencies in land, trade, commerce and finance. Some of these ties were also cemented by family connections. Family ties crisscrossed the empire. Robert Campbell's brother was head of a major Calcutta merchant company. Edward Riley lived and worked in Calcutta for a number of years, his first wife dying in India. He remarried there to the daughter of a British colonel in Calcutta, and together they settled in New South Wales in 1816, with Riley becoming a leading merchant in the colony. Caroline Chisholm lived in Madras for 6 years before arriving in Sydney in 1838 with her husband, a military man, and 3 sons. He was recalled to India in 1840, while Caroline remained to become a prominent philanthropist and charity worker. Harriet Blaxland, wife of John Blaxland, prominent landowner, merchant, and persistent irritant to successive governors of New South Wales, was the daughter of a prosperous French merchant in Calcutta. Harriet Mary, their daughter, spent a considerable portion of her childhood with relatives in India and married a partner in a mercantile firm and lived in Agra within sight of the Taj Mahal. Widowed, she later married Sir James Dowling, the second Chief Justice of New South Wales and member of the Legislative Council. Here were family connections across New South Wales, England and India, Mother and daughter were by no means unusual in having family links scattered across the empire. Well, from these prominent families came many of the early colonial politicians, integral to the birth of democracy in New South Wales. Just look at some of the early members of the New South Wales Legislative Council. Almost all of them were substantial landowners and had a stake in a thriving economy based on land, sea and trade. Amongst the judges, Anglican ministers, administrators and government officers, most of them also landowners, are the merchants, who acquired substantial land holdings, a number of whom thrived and sometimes crashed and burned in the boom and bust economies of the free trade empire. Take Richard Jones, for example, widely known as China Jones, member of the Legislative Council from 1829 to 1843 and briefly again between 1850 and 1852. Born in 1786, Jones arrives in Sydney in 1809 and quickly establishes himself as an agent for Forbes & Co., a Bombay-based company trading in spirits. Later, he goes into partnership with Edward Riley, and by the 1820s, this merchant house, now known as Jones, Riley and Walker, was the most prosperous in the colony, with extensive trading links with China, the East Indies, India, Mauritius, New Caledonia, New Zealand and Van Diemen's Land, trading in goods such as tea, porcelain and furniture from China, hence his nickname. Jones also owned five whaling ships plying the seas around Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. He knew how to get the full economic network working together. With his growing wealth and extensive connections, he became a significant pastoralist with nearly 20,000 acres granted and purchased over the years, pioneering the Saxon breed of sheep. Nomination, obviously, to the Legislative Council soon followed. He was a noted conservative who opposed Governor Burke's liberal reforms, instituting greater civil rights for emancipists. Jones, however, was an influential member of the early council, sitting on almost all the select committees of the period. Alexander Berry, member of the Legislative Council from 1828 to 1856, was another merchant and landowner, largely in the Shoalhaven, who had extensive commercial relationships with British firms and in the wider colonial South Pacific and Asian region. Berry, born in Scotland, was a surgeon's mate on various ships plying their trade in India, the Cape Colony and the East Indies before arriving in Sydney in 1808. He engaged in a number of trading ventures, with voyages to Cape Colony, South America, New Zealand, Fiji and back to various ports in Europe. And later, in partnership with Edward Wollstonecraft, they became a major trading firm. He's granted 10,000 acres in the Shoalhaven district by Governor Brisbane, and he expanded his holdings significantly over coming years, buying up a number of local farms. By the 1860s, he had 40,000 acres. A noted conservative like Jones, he was much less active than Jones, but he still held his seat in the council for many years. And there are others with similar stories of mercantile and pastoral interconnections. Robert Campbell, for one, and of course the MacArthurs, John, James and Hannibal. I don't need to go into their careers, they're all well known. And of course we have wonderful books by Alan Atkinson and others on the MacArthurs that enrich the story I'm trying to tell here. But it's worth noting that in 1824, when John MacArthur and James Ebsworth called a meeting in London to establish the Australian Agricultural Company, in attendance was a representative of the Bank of England, 4 directors of the East India Company, as well as a number of East India Company shareholders. Empire, and of course, back to the heartland of Britain itself, people moved around the empire and had commercial, religious, political and familial connections that traversed vast swathes of imperial territory. Early colonists lived in an empire, not just a colony. We can glimpse some of the impact of this wider imperial world in the evolution of Australian democracy in the early years of the colony. There were models in the empire that stood as examples for those crafting the formation of key institutions in New South Wales, such as the Supreme Court, the Legislative Council, and later the Legislative Assembly. The East India Company, established in 1600, was essentially a body of shareholders established by Royal Charter to expand England's trading routes in India and the East Indies, although it appointed a governor and a council in each of its major presidencies. It was a model that influenced new colonies in North America, notably the Virginia Company in 1606 and the Massachusetts Company of 1629. Both of these were, like the East India Company, joint stock companies. The Virginia colony was governed by a council appointed by the king, and in Massachusetts, the Great and Grand Court began as an elected body from amongst the shareholders, but a few years later expanded its constituency to incorporate elected representatives from each of the districts in the colony, with the qualification being that only Puritans of substantial means could vote. From 1689, however, the Massachusetts governor was appointed by the Crown, although the General Court remained an elected body, acting as a check on the power of governors. It was the General Court that tore down these institutions in 1776, establishing a provincial Congress, and from 1779 writing its own constitution, now free of the British yoke. Company and Crown yokes that were thrown off were the beginnings of an important shift in the nature and character of British imperialism. It's not just that forms of commerce change in this period, but also forms of governance in the transition to free trade imperialism. Indeed, I think we need to unpack this term free trade imperialism a bit. Up until the 19th century, British interests were largely advanced by what Philip Stern has called corporate or venture colonialism. Numerous joint stock companies were formed from the 17th century with Crown and parliamentary approval, and sometimes funding. And sometimes the Crown bought large shares in these companies, and members of Parliament were large shareholders in these joint stock companies as well. And occasionally, to protect their shareholder interests, the Crown sent armies to support some of these companies. And they spread across the globe, becoming, in many respects, company states. Almost every American colony before 1776 largely began as a company state. When we look more widely, there was the East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and the Sword Blade Bank, which is the 7th biggest corporation in the world in the late 18th century. Between 1750 and 1800, the English Parliament approved 648 stock companies just to operate canals, rivers, and harbours. That just gives you one sense of the gigantic nature of the joint stock company ethos of the 18th century that fueled British imperial growth. These companies remained very powerful till the early to mid-19th century, as Britain gradually transitioned to the Crown taking over governance from companies and then opening up those areas to broader free trade. But the free trade, I think, has to be seen in its governance as well as its trade connotations. And this had a significant transformation. One of the interesting things about New South Wales is it's very early. The Crown establishes the colony, not a company. The companies come later. And interesting, why we always think of South Australia as different, South Australia is established by a company. So there's some subtle and interesting differences there in the evolution of Australia, and how important. I don't think we've come to recognise the importance of that venture capitalism, venture imperialism, as a context in which New South Wales emerges from in an unusual and different way that has important connotations. Obviously, the British Parliament are all too aware of the American colony's revolt when shaping governance for the colony of New South Wales. That, and the fact that it began as a penal colony, cemented the power of early governors, largely unchecked by any other authority than the Crown and the Parliament. And there's certainly no corporations, they come later. But the growth of free settler and emancipist populations meant the push for a say in the governance of the colony obviously gathered momentum, with the first significant milestones being, as we celebrate today and as we will hear in papers later today in much greater detail, with the establishment of the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court. But there are other examples of colonial governance that Australian colonists could draw on, especially as prominent colonists in New South Wales began to urge checks on governors' power and a voice for prominent citizens. As I've said and explained, they had connections all around the empire. Canada's an interesting case, where many administrators and colonists had some experience of those North American colonies. Nova Scotia established its Legislative Council appointed by the governor in 1719, but from 1758 the council was transformed into an upper house with an elected House Assembly holding executive and legislative duties. New South Wales may have been a British colony drawing on British laws and institutions of governance, but like other colonies in the empire, it could never be a carbon copy. Institutions had to adapt to local circumstances and conditions. An appointed Legislative Council had echoes elsewhere in the empire, but was original in its constitution and appointment here. And the push for elected representatives gained traction, and gradually the council and subsequently the assembly became bodies of elected representatives, as did many similar institutions in other settler colonies. Colonies could be places of innovation, places where citizens look beyond Britain for inspiration or develop their own models of governance and public administration. In looking at the full 19th century, fingerprinting, for example, for the identification of criminals was first trialled in India. The concentration camp originated in South Africa for the control of Boers. And nearly 100 years after Alexander Maconochie first introduced his mark system in Norfolk Island in the early 1840s, penal experts at international penitentiary conferences and congresses in Europe and North America were still citing this as one of the key innovations of modern Western penology. And let's not forget Australia's great contribution to democracy, the secret ballot. First trialled in Tasmania in 1856 and adopted by all the other colonies in the next couple of years. Or the unusual idea of compulsory voting in 1922. Let's not overlook Australia's own constitution, fundamentally drawing on the Westminster system, but with elements of the American Constitution in the framing of Australia's upper house. Australian public administrators of the 19th century actually had a remarkably global outlook. They corresponded with and often took extensive visits overseas to shape public administration in the colony. In 1868, New South Wales funded the tour of Frederick Norton Manning to lunatic asylums throughout Britain, Western Europe and North America. Who would fund a full 12 months tour for a public servant these days? To bring back the best international practices for the administration of lunacy in the colonies. And they sent him off again in 1875 to refresh his ideas. In the 1880s, George Tucker, who was a very good friend of Henry Parkes, but also the proprietor of Bayview House, a private lunatic asylum in Tempe, spent a year overseas travelling to over 800 lunatic asylums in Britain, Western and Eastern Europe, North Africa, Asia, North and South America, to bring back the latest thinking on treatment. And his 1887 book, Lunacy in Many Lands, is the best and most comprehensive guide to 19th century lunacy administration in the world that's ever been published. And there were similar grand tours by bureaucrats interested in fields such as technical education in 1887, again in 1904, solutions to industrial strife in 1891, neglected children 1913, workers' houses 1913, agricultural schools 1914, and other colonies followed suit. Victorian bureaucrats travelled overseas to report on charitable institutions in 1862, prisons in 1878, schoolrooms in 1880, railway construction in 1876, and technical education in 1899. Frederick William Nietenstein, the Comptroller General of Prisons in New South Wales, in the 1890s corresponded with leading criminologists all around the world, including Lombroso, and visited prisons overseas. And in the first decade of the 20th century, Sir Charles McKellar spent some time overseas visiting juvenile reformatories, because he was in charge of juvenile reformatories in New South Wales. His daughter, Dorothea, accompanied him and started to draft her most famous poem, reflecting her homesickness while staying in dreary England while her father toured Borstals. 19th century New South Wales was really a remarkable experiment in governance and administration, shaped by its position and the experience of many of its citizens in the wider imperial and international networks of commerce, law, administration and politics. Democracy in Australia is a distinctively Australian story, but one profoundly influenced by its international context. Thank you. Now I get to sit right over here.
You get to sit over there, yes.
So when the rotten tomatoes come, you miss out on it.
Thank you, Stephen, for that incredibly insightful presentation. We now have time for questions from the audience, both the audience here in person as well as those watching online, and the staff will read out the questions coming from online. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and I will call on you to ask your question. Any questions? Yes, we'll start with the President.
I promise this
Yeah,
isn't a set.
there's some two roving mics as well coming around. Thanks.
I was fascinated when you mentioned that the New South Wales Constitution, or I should say the American Constitution, impacted the New South Wales Legislative Council. Could you speak a bit more about that?
No, the Australian Federation, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could you speak a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, just the notion of a Senate, the upper house, being, you can't do the House of Lords, obviously, in the colonial context. So they're looking around, and if you look at some of those federation debates of the 1890s, they're looking around at kind of models for an upper house, because they believe an upper house is very important, a house of review, which it is very much in the Westminster system, and they do an adaptation of the kind of American model of having an equal number of senators from each state. So there's a rich historiography now on some of those influences in the nature of the Australian Constitution. Now, there are plenty of other differences between what happens in Australia and the American, not least in what powers are granted to the Commonwealth in the Australian Constitution. I'm actually on a research project at the moment looking at the impact of World War II on Australian higher education. And under the Australian Constitution, the Commonwealth has no powers over education until 1943, when they exercised the defence powers in order to intervene in universities. And then there's a referendum, one of the 8, that succeeds in 1946, which gives the Commonwealth limited powers over education. But until 1943, the Commonwealth had no powers in the sphere of education. They're entirely state-based entities. So the Australian Constitution is fascinating in what it gives to the Commonwealth and what it doesn't give to the Commonwealth. But again, the upper house draws on models like the American notion of a Senate with an equal proportion across.
Further questions? Yes, right up the back there, back row.
Can I just ask?
The mic's coming around.
I won't stand up because I might just block the cameras, which are right behind me. Can I just ask, during this time of borrowing ideas from around the empire, can I just ask about slavery? Were any of the colonial administrators and settlers and merchants and so on who came via other colonies, were they exposed to slavery? First question. And the second was, what part in their thinking in development of democracy in New South Wales did the kind of rapid unwinding of the Atlantic slave trade and views towards slavery have in their thinking here in New South Wales?
Yep. Very, very good question. And actually, this is a big debate going on at the present point in time. Now, there are a couple of nuances. The thing that's really transformed historical discussion of slavery in the last kind of decade or so is the going online, the digitisation of the 1833 slavery compensation. So the British Parliament decides that it has to stop slavery more than the earlier abolition, but needed to compensate slave owners. So actually established an extraordinary system of compensating slave owners according to the number of slaves they had. And that was one big payment. It was millions and millions of pounds. And we now have a database of everyone who received compensation through that system. And historians are trawling through that as we speak with forensic attention to the detail. And there is, and some evidence emerging, that some of that money flowed into Australia. Now, they're not owning slaves, but their wealth in part comes from slaves that either their family or their forebears owned, and that fueled some of the wealth inside the colony. The more tricky aspect that you've alluded to is, did we actually have slaves in the colony itself? Now, there's some debate about coolie labour being imported by some of those early pastoralists, and there were efforts, but there was resistance to some of that in the colony because, again, you've got missionaries and evangelicals, abolitionists who don't want that happening. But you've got Kanaka labour coming into Queensland in the later 19th century. So this is a real area of current historical investigation. The universities are currently going through a bit of a kind of rethink. Did they receive money from donors whose wealth derived from that slave Compensation Act of 1833? There's a recent article published that compared Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney, and of course we all at Sydney thought, Sydney's bound to be the worst, but Adelaide was the worst, which was very comforting. Sydney didn't come out too badly at all. But this is an important area of investigation, and so no, we don't have a formal slavery unless you start thinking about the Kanaka stuff. But there's some evidence there that there's some slavery issues embedded in early colonial culture, and certainly some money that we need to investigate more closely.
Further questions? Yeah, Jeremy.
Professor, the governors of New South Wales, so Macquarie, Brisbane, William Stewart for a couple of weeks, Darling were all veterans of imperial wars. They'd fought in the War of Independence, Napoleonic Wars, the Caribbean, South America, India, very violent, brutal campaigns of conquest. How do you think their experiences of war and conquest informed their administration of the growth of the colony into the Aboriginal lands around Bathurst and beyond?
Very good question. And look, they're military and naval men who believe in authority, and when pushed, obviously would resort to arms. I mean, there's some interesting stuff about restraint in some of those early governors not wanting to resort to arms, because remember the First Fleet, they're actually given instructions to make friends with the Indigenous peoples. But obviously under threat, there are issues. Now there's some interesting stuff being done more recently about those early interactions. And some linguistic stuff being done where, you know, words are being which we've traditionally interpreted as being words of aggression. Aboriginal language linguists are saying, well, actually, they're not words of aggression. They're words of surprise and who are these people and are they ghosts kind of stuff. So there's, you know, that mismatch between culture. We don't understand their culture, they don't understand our culture, and how that can lead to conflict is a really important area of understanding and exploring those sorts of issues. But undoubtedly, you know, as military men, if they see colonists under threat, they're going to, when spears are throwing, they fight back. And again, it leads to bloodshed. Very unfortunate, partly because of that cultural misunderstanding or lack of knowledge and understanding and ability to navigate those incredibly complex cross-cultural things. And there we have it. And remember, many of those wars that they fought in India and elsewhere, not in the Peninsular Wars or any of those, but in India and other areas, they're fighting partly for the Crown, but partly for the company. So they're also fighting for joint stock companies, and joint stock companies have that really interesting mix of being governing entities and trading profit-making entities, and protecting trade routes and protecting vital capital resources, many of which, you know, as I explained, the Crown is a major shareholder and parliamentarians. You know, it's a very that whole 18th century issue of British imperialism is enormously complex, and it becomes a bit more clarified in the 19th century, and the Crown says, oh, we're just taken over. We've got to have much more control over what's going on. Whereas in the 18th century, they kind of feed it into these joint stock companies to kind of do what they want.
Further questions? Yeah, to the lady here in the middle of the room.
We were influenced a lot. We took influences from other parts of the empire and the Americas, but Australia also developed its own innovations in governance, which were ultimately had influence elsewhere in the world. How did those ideas arise in Australia, and how did they come to influence other democracies, such as the secret ballot and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So again, you know, it's colonists sitting around thinking through the issues that they face at this particular point in time and what's the best way of dealing with it. I mean, they're obviously looking at exactly what's happening back in the UK and what's happening in legislation. But if you look at 19th century legislation, there are British acts that the colony refuses to enact because it doesn't feel that it's appropriate to colonial conditions. And then there are other things where you've got an emerging middle class keen for political representation and keen for a broader representation in than is possible or currently enacted in the UK, to have a say in the governance of the colonies. So there you go, the secret ballot. You don't want those situations in the USA. And sometimes in the UK, where you get up before all the villagers give you a speech pelted with rotten tomatoes, and then the vote goes, and people are subjected to violence and being beaten up if they're voting the wrong way. So the secret ballot is genuinely a kind of, and it catches on suddenly, you know, because there are so many acts of violence at public voting situations, that it's a really unique and interesting thing. The other puzzling aspect is compulsory voting. Well, it's compulsory to register from 1901. It's not actually compulsory to vote until 1922, and I haven't quite discovered the full reasons why it waits to 1922 for the actual compulsory vote. But I mean, strangely, I found this piece of evidence in an African American newspaper of the 1920s, where they were commenting on the strangeness of the Australian legislation. But looking at those forms of legislation is a fascinating historical enterprise, to look at the acts that we did not pursue. We have a difference in the UK, for example, over the age of consent. The age of consent is higher in the UK than it is in New South Wales. I hate to say this, but the New South Wales parliamentarian said, you know, girls ripen quicker in the tropics, so it has to be lower. So there are all those kind of issues about what is the nature of colonial society and how is it different. And of course there's debates about the convict inheritance, and you might need stronger policing, and of course our police force draws a lot on the Royal Irish Constabulary model in the 19th century, and so on and so forth. So it is about serious colonists thinking through the nature of their colony, and it is different to everywhere else in the world. There are examples, and they pick and choose what works for them, and they bring in things for themselves that they think fit their circumstances that don't fit the circumstances of other colonies.
Before I go to a further question from the audience, I'll just see with the staff if there's any from online. No, none. Any further questions? Yeah, gentleman here.
Professor, when you talk about free trade, can you elaborate on the meaning of the word free? What does that relate to?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a long debate within the history of British imperialism, talking about the free trade empire. So what they're meaning there, it's a complicated thing because there's also gunboat diplomacy and various other aspects. So the English forces will enforce free trade, but really it's about the shift away from those joint stock companies being the basis for British advancement in the world. And they break down those joint stock companies. The East India Company is really effectively, it's purely an administrative machinery for India from 1833 onwards. So it's breaking down those monopoly companies and opening it up to anyone who can prosper in that environment.
Further questions? Yeah, just here in the middle.
Professor, I just wondered if, when you're talking about the influences, the global influences on our society in New South Wales, did you discern anything that was influenced by our Indigenous population in the governance or the other areas of colonial administration? Was there anything that they particularly influenced us?
I'm not an expert on 19th century Indigenous history, so I can't really answer that with any authority. But when I look at all of those public administrators who are running the major departments in New South Wales and other colonies, they're really looking overseas. And not just to the UK, not just to England and Scotland in particular. They're travelling widely, looking at best practice internationally. Because actually, I do think this is kind of an interesting hallmark of Australian cultural life. When I think about 20th century universities and 20th century academics, Australian academics are much more broad-ranging in their thinking. If you're in America, you only read what Americans write. If you're in England, you only read what people in England write, and occasionally what an American might write. If you're an Australian academic, you read all the stuff that's being done in Britain, all the stuff that's being done in Europe, and all the stuff that's being done in America. So I just think the nature of being a colony on the kind of edge of the world gives you a global outlook and gives you a sense that you need to draw best practice for your circumstances. Right? I do think it's a kind of interesting hallmark of Australian culture, is its international perspective. And I think that continues to this very day. You go to American conference. I go to American conferences or British conferences. I find they're so insular. They don't know what's been read elsewhere. And I do think those bureaucrats set this fantastic precedent of wandering around the world, and they go to Central Europe, and they go to Russia, and they go to North Africa just to find out, is there something there that's interesting, important, and could be adapted to Australian conditions. I think it's one of the really nice aspects of Australian culture is our kind of international perspective.
Probably just one final question that we have time for, if there's any final questions in the room. Yep, just here, yep.
Our Governor, Sir George Gipps, had been on a commission of inquiry in Canada, and then when he was here as Governor, the Durham report came out, and I haven't read enough about it yet, but I assume the Durham report came up with some solutions to the problems in Canada. And do you think the Durham report had an influence on the staged evolution of independence here in New South Wales?
I have no formal proof, but I know that they're reading it. So, again, they're reading all of this stuff that's coming out of the broader imperial context. And Canada, they find Canada interesting. Canada is, a lot of colonists have had some experience of Canada, and if they haven't had personal experience of Canada, they're looking at Canada because it's a really, particularly after the American colonies become, they're really looking at what's happening in Canada. Now, of course, Canada's got some fascinating differences to the Australian context, and of course it's got the issue of the French and Quebecois independence and all those sorts of tensions that Australia doesn't have. But they're reading what's happening elsewhere in the empire. They're looking at what's happening in South Africa. They're in Cape Colony in particular. They're looking wherever they can to get ideas and inspiration and concerns things about what they shouldn't do. So again, I think that broader international framework is kind of plugged into colonial thinking and unpicking that. We do them a disservice by just focusing just on the colonial context. They're broad thinkers who are looking around for things that are important, that they think they can do something with. They're practical, they're pragmatic, they're solutions oriented. There's a kind of, again, Okay, there's a historiography on Australian utilitarianism, Australian 19th century political culture, very utilitarian, greatest good, greatest number, what works really, and they're very pragmatic and happy to pick and choose bits and pieces, taking them out of context and adapting them because they think it's going to work in the colonial context.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you to everyone who did contribute with your questions, and please join me in thanking Stephen for his excellent presentation and Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much to Chris Rath for facilitating such a great opening to the conference and such fantastic questions from the audience. Can I just indicate that I have a sense that a couple of those questions we might be hearing some more by way of answers to a couple of them tomorrow. We've got a couple of the professors who are going to be addressing us tomorrow here in the audience. So welcome David Roberts and Frank Bongiorno. Can I also acknowledge the members of Parliament who are here, in addition to Mr President and Chris Rath, the Honourable Jeremy Buckingham, Mr Gareth Ward MP, Mr Hugh McDermott MP. It's excellent to have you here with us. And can I also say in relation to the question from Jeremy Buckingham, that's a topic that I suspect we'll be exploring in a little bit more detail next year in the course of further bicentenary activities.